in this talk, I'd like to explore some of the work we've done at this end of the arc, the Oxford end of the arc, probably the Wild West from Cambridge's point of view, looking at the proposals for Ox-Cam Arc development. The first message I want to give you, despite what the government says, is the Ox-Cam Arc really isn't unique. There are other places in the UK, I'm going to show you some, which are equally suited for this level of development and quite frankly more in need of it and more capable of absorbing it. The trouble with ARC thinking to date is it's been very silo-based. We've had the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Housing, the Department of Business and so on. And it's certainly, there hasn't been adequate communication between them. It's been silo-based thinking. In the process, nature is being commodified. It's being traded. At present, for example, funds will only be available for the art's nature in exchange for development. No development, no funding for nature. It's a quid pro quo. And unfortunately, the techniques being used in this trade, biodiversity net gain, natural capital accounting, are either deeply flawed or they concentrate on only one part of the whole picture. And I'll try to explain that in the talk. These flaws lead to an incorrect valuation or an undervaluation of the nature across the arc. Human wealth is the sum of both stocks and the yields of human, natural, and economic capital, and they shouldn't be measured by just one component of one of those three, such as gross domestic product, GDP, which has dominated and driven economics in the last century. Habitat fragmentation across the arc is very, very severe. In fact, the average size of many protected habitats is about that of a rugby pitch, 1 hectare. Doubling nature in this situation is going to be very, very difficult and almost certainly impossible if it only occurs as a quid pro quo for development somewhere else. So let's have a look at what's the plans involved. Well, the arc started life as a donut. The idea of a golden donut around London was born in the early years of this century. And you can see the donut is outside London's green belt, but within easy commuting distance of the capital city. The donut was effectively a dormitory donut for London commuters. That was the suggestion. And then in about 2005, people identified key towns in that donut, London, Oxford, and Cambridge. So this was the lock, the golden triangle, still dependent on the radial routes out of London of both, of course, roads and rail. And then in 2016, the National Infrastructure Commission looked at east-west links rather than radial links from London and came up with the idea of the arc, the Ox-Cam arc between Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, stretching in each direction, Felixstowe in your direction and onto Newbury and the west in our direction. Effectively, the arc is the outer M25. And the significance of that is it needed to carry freight. It needed to decant some of the freight from the overcrowded M25. So that's how the arc was born. It was born as the product of a donut. Now, the key document describing the arc, the playbook for the arc effectively at the present time, is the National Infrastructure Commission's Partnering for Prosperity document produced in 2018. And it had 5 pillars for the development of the region. And it's probably best to start at the bottom here, the 163 billion increase in economic output. This was the economic prize. And then that involved creating 1 million new jobs, 1 million new houses, the Oxford-Cambridge Expressway and East-West Railway. All of those 5 pillars. Now, as Wendy remarked, the Ox-Cam Expressway was recently cancelled and it should never have been suggested in the first place. It still leaves 4 pillars and the economic ambitions remain exactly as they were before. Contributions to the Partnering for Prosperity document came from several different ministries, from Cambridge Econometrics, for example, from Savills House Builders, from Highways England and so on, and from Network Rail for the East-West Railway suggestions. And after it was produced, other ministries got involved, the Department of Business Studies, Housing, England's Economic Heartlands, and then the collection of art universities, the yellow document there, and finally the nature charities, NGOs, the wildlife trusts, the woodland trusts, and the RSPB. And of course, property developers were not cold to the fact there was huge development opportunities in the arc itself. And I'm forced to point out that other property developers are available, but there's incredible interest because building a house in the south of the country provides 2 to 3 times the profit of building a house anywhere else in the country at the moment. Let's look at one of the first myths, the myth that the Ox Camargue is unique, that there is no alternative. There isn't any alternative because the NIC didn't look at any alternative. It gave us the Ox Camargue, it didn't look at the alternatives. But it already had in its possession this product from Grant Thornton, dated 2014, who looked at alternative growth corridors in England. And you can see there were several other alternatives, many radiating from London, but a few away from London. And then after the report came out, John Reed Smart Growth UK asked the question, well, are there other ARCs across the UK which are just as good as the Ox Camargue? And John relatively easily found at least 5 of them just in England. He didn't look at Scotland and Wales. And these have all the advantages of the Ox Camargue and few of the disadvantages. For example, there's much better public transport in many of these. The universities are just as good, housing is cheap, and labour is available. There's pretty full employment in the Ox Camargue. So if you want extra jobs, you have to import the labour from elsewhere. And then more recently, still the Catapult and Centre for Cities report looked at growth hubs in the country, and it also looked in Scotland and in Wales, and it identified one growth hub in each of the regions outside the overheated southeast. So it excluded the southeast and London, but it found one growth hub possibility in the other regions easily. So the ARC is by no means unique, and we have to question, why is so much attention being devoted to it at the moment? Is it possible that the proposers of the ARC are mostly ex-students of Oxford or Cambridge universities? Here are all those growth proposals superimposed on each other. You can see there's quite a degree of agreement between the alternative proposals over the last half a dozen years or so. The second myth about the Ox Camargue, I'm not quite sure if you can see everything here, part of that screen's obscured, is that the Ox Camargue, or the developing the ARC, can at the same time save nature. And I want to spend the rest of this talk showing the problems of that proposal. But first of all, we have to dig back into the Partnering for Prosperity report to see what's being threatened. I mentioned the million homes. This is a map in the same document in which the outlines, I'm outlining what is effectively the whole of Oxfordshire here, represent the different geographical units. The other outlines don't represent the ceremonial counties, but rather strange parts of them. So in Cambridge, you've got parts of Cambridgeshire and parts of Hertfordshire as well, for example, and not all of Cambridgeshire. This is the way Savills chose to model it. And as Wendy pointed out, this area here, which I'm going to call Cambridge briefly, was targeted with 271,000 of those million houses. The pie charts on this map show the distribution of houses. The pie charts add up to the million houses. And if we look just at Cambridgeshire, we've got 3 different colours on the pie chart. The pink represents currently planned homes, those in existing local plans for your area. In blue, we've got homes for London commuters. They're pretty upfront about it. These are homes for London commuters. And then the additional homes which would be unlocked by all Ox Camargue developments. And you can see in Cambridge's case, it's not quite half. In the case of the other counties, it's more than half. So about 2/3 of the total million houses are due to be unlocked by Ox Camargue development. And the dark blue there, 23% of those million homes will be for London commuters. So we are going to be part of the dormitory donut, whether we like it or not. These are the percentage increase in the current total housing stock. Cambridge at the moment has just over about 330,000 houses, I think. So what's being threatened in these plans represents an 81% increase in your total housing stock to 2050. And the yellow across the map represents that for other places. In Oxfordshire, our total housing stock will more than double if these plans come about. In the bottom right here, we have the Office of National Statistics estimate of the increase in the UK population. In fact, it's the increase in the UK households to 2050, 16%. So the question is, why is so much of the growth being concentrated in such a small part of the country? Why should the Arc suffer this level of expansion when on average the country is going to grow only by 16% to 2050. Two key documents about Arc developments appeared in February this year. One was called the Arc Spatial Framework, sort of beginning to lay out the plan for the spatial framework of the Arc and concentrating on economics, housing and the environment. And the other is England's Economic Heartland. It's about a regional transport strategy. Now, I don't have time to discuss these documents in full. Here's a link here to our website that discusses that document and to our website here. And there's a link at the bottom to a talk I gave with more details on these plans. But the takeaway from these two documents is it's still 1 million houses. Although the documents refuse to say how many houses, the economic ambitions remain as they ever were. Those economic ambitions involve 1 million houses across the Arc by 2050. It's still 1 million houses. As we saw in that earlier graph, the ONS predicts an increase in the UK population of about 16% to 2050. That 16% requires approximately 3 million more houses across all of the areas in white, the UK in this map here. One of those 3 million houses, 1 million of those 3 million, will go into the Oxcam Arc. And the question that arises really is, why should 1/3 of UK housing growth to 2050 go into less than 1/20th of the UK's land area, which the 5 Oxcam counties represent, with only 5.7% of the UK's population? It's an incredible amount of overdevelopment in a very small part of the country, which is already overheated economically. It doesn't make any economic sense. And the tragedy is today, there has been really absolutely no democratic engagement whatsoever of any of these ministries. We've got a few here. There are several more that I could add now. And the ministries and the ministers and their representatives simply are not talking to the 3.7 million people who live along the Arc at present and who will be most affected by this overdevelopment plan. We were told at a meeting as recently as February by Chris Krasnowski, the portfolio director, this is a Whitewall plan. Other people have said it's a creature of Whitehall. I know that local authorities, after the cancellation of the expressway, were relieved, and they said, well, that allows us to control our own development. No, it doesn't. This is still a Whitehall plan, and this is being looked after by number 10 and 11 Downing Street. This is one of Boris's priorities at the present time. So let's have a look at what silo thinking that I mentioned before proposes for the Arc that leads to the overdevelopment of the Oxcam Arc. We've had several different groups working in their silos on different aspects of Oxcam Arc development. This first map here comes from Jim Hall's group, the ITRC group, that were looking at the best place for new settlements, new towns or expanded towns. And these are the areas shown in orange on the map here. And this area here near Milton Keynes isn't Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes is here, Bedford. It's the area between Milton Keynes and Marston Vale. The development of already pretty well developed areas, or the expansion, for example, around Marlow here, considerable expansion there. Now, Jim Hall always emphasizes these are possible scenarios for growth, but basically you could put the red patches in several different places, and that's the plan for future communities. And then separately from that, we have the local nature partnerships, which are a collection of local authorities, local enterprise partnerships and wildlife trusts, talking about environmental opportunity areas. And these are the sort of pale green areas here on this map. And they're defined as areas, as you can see, areas that might offer offsetting opportunities to developers. This is like saying to developers, come and help yourself to this land here. You've got to put a bit of cash in to improve the situation here, but it's an offsetting opportunity. We'll look at offsetting a bit later on. Now, you know this well enough. These are the areas of outstanding natural beauty. My area, you've got the Chilterns, you've got the Greensand Ridges. In your areas, you've got the Fens. These are beautiful areas. They don't need improving, surely not. They're pretty good already. And strangely enough, exactly the same map appears in wildlife NGO literature described as core areas of existing high value for nature. These are areas that we really shouldn't touch with development. They don't need offsetting, they need protecting. And then another map that we can put on top of this is nature recovery networks. This is the dark green and the orange segments here. Now, NRNs, nature recovery networks, are designed to join up the fairly patchy habitats of nature that we wish to protect. It's creating nature corridors, which is an idea from John Lawton's Making Space for Nature document of 2010. And then finally, of course, we can look at the plans for transport across the region. And fairly recently, England's Economic Heartland came up with this map of, it's a map of 10 of 13 in total road corridors across the arc that they want to enhance or improve to improve the transport links across the corridor. Now, and these are the oblongs of different colours. Now you can see those oblongs of different colours cut right across everything else under the map. And if there's one thing that stops us joining nature up in nature recovery networks, it's infrastructure, it's roads, it's railways. So the conclusion is we really can't have it all. We can't have all of these things. This is a product of silo mentality, 4 different silos developing the same area, and they're simply incompatible with each other. The question is, how much of each of these do we need or do we want? The history of our production of nature is really rather a protection of nature as a sad one. So the early protection of the environment set aside through legislation sites of special scientific interest, sites of active conservation, SACs and so on. They were protected by law. And then planning laws gave a lower level of protection to other areas such as green belts because of their public health and their amenity values, especially, of course, near towns and cities. Now, the problem is that as we develop pressure on land for infrastructure, for example, HS2, or housing in Greenbelt, was resolved by relaxing or simply ignoring the rules of the exceptional circumstances clause, for example, of the National Planning Policy Framework. And that raised the question of whether or not inevitable habitat destruction in some places, Greenbelt or HS2, could be compensated for by protection or development elsewhere. This is where the ideas of offsetting and net biodiversity gain came from. Now, if you're going to offset or look for gain, you need a metric to measure how well you're doing. And this is where Defra's biodiversity metric that we'll look at in a minute comes from. And then an alternative way of looking at the impact on nature was to do natural capital accounting, which puts a monetary value on gains and losses. This allowed nature to be brought into an economic framework in a way that the biodiversity metric, which has no units to it, does not. So let's have a look at biodiversity offsetting, the simplest of it, biodiversity offsetting. This is from a Defra document, and it explains 3 scenarios. Scenario A is the easiest, and it makes the point that if you're going to develop, we have an area of land here represented by 1 tree. A developer wants to build houses. Now, the first instruction is you have to avoid harm. Avoid harm if you can, reduce harm if you can, enhance the building site if you can. And in scenario A, whereas we had trees here, at the end of development, we have houses, but we have more trees. So in this case, we've got on-site offsetting. We've offset the houses by developing nature on-site. That's scenario A. It's going to be a rare one, I think. Scenario B, we have nature to begin with here. We want to build houses. We can allow a few trees on the building site, but not as many as the ones we chopped down to build the houses. So we have to have some compensatory habitat creation elsewhere. This is the offsetting scheme to make up for the loss due to the housing. And in theory, that offset site should be close to the development site so that the local communities can still enjoy the amenity value of the offset site. The tragedy will come when we have exactly the same scenario as scenario B, but in this case, there are no local sites for offsetting. In that situation, the developer has to pay a tariff, a cash sum, and that cash sum can be spent anywhere in the country, elsewhere, a long way away, for conservation measures. You can rewild somewhere. But of course, in that case, the local community experiences all the pain of development and sees none of the gain of offsetting. For the Ox Camargue, no development equals no funds for nature. Absolutely, there aren't any free funds for nature. You've got to pay for the development of nature by losing some of it for development. Now, biodiversity offsetting can be likened to taking Westminster Abbey, turning it into a pile of bricks, moving the bricks elsewhere to the offset site. Here we are arriving on the offset site, leaving the pile of stones there and saying it's the same. Of course it isn't the same. It isn't the same, and it never will be the same probably. It's going to take tens or even hundreds of years to regrow, and that isn't certain. Success isn't certain. So we destroy part of nature, and we hope to improve other parts of nature to make up for our destruction. Offsetting is the certain destruction of habitats in one place for the uncertain hope of reconstructing it elsewhere with a net gain. There have been many reviews of offsetting. We haven't done much offsetting in the UK, but it's been practiced a lot in America and on the continent. And you can see here the reviews of offsetting aren't very optimistic. Offsetting has often failed to achieve the objectives. In Australia, for example, the idea that there should be no net loss of biodiversity, well, what they're saying here is going to take at least 140 years for the offset sites to be as good as the sites that were developed, that were destroyed for development. We've had very limited experience. There was a review of some pilot offsets in the UK, and it concluded the markets were immature. The interesting comment here is why these failed. First of all, there weren't suitable offset sites, and there was an unwillingness of developers to pay for the full impacts, and those are going to be critical in Ox Camargue development, as we're going to see in a minute. And then a couple of years ago, there was a huge review of global projects for offsetting by the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology in the University of Kent. They looked at, as you could see, they looked at 15,000 published articles that mentioned offsetting. And from those 15,000, there were really only 32 studies with quantitative data from which they could measure whether or not no net loss was achieved. So basically, you're only replacing what you take away. There's no gain, but there's no net loss. And the studies that they did look at covered a huge area of land, in fact, 2% of the global offset areas. This is actually quite a large sample size, considering we talk about the global ecosystem. And these are the results. The critical one was 1/3 of those projects achieved no net loss. That's the green column here. 2/3 did not. That's the other one. They had either they didn't achieve it, or they had mixed outcomes, or it couldn't be discerned whether there was an improvement at all. Only 1/3 of projects agreed no net loss. Wetland studies tend to have good outcomes, but there was net loss in all of the studies that involved forests, all of them. This isn't a very good track record for offsetting. And Dieter Helm in a webinar in 2019 said, no one has yet achieved net environmental gain at scale. Now we're going to look at the Defra biodiversity metric. I want to show how flawed it is a measure of what we're losing on the development site and what we might be gaining in the offset site. And I'm going to talk you through how to calculate it. And there are lots of lines on this slide, but let's take it one at a time. What you as a developer would have to do is identify the site that you want to develop. We're going to imagine developing 10 hectares of upland calcareous grassland. You need to know the area, and within the calculation of the metric, you can have one of 133 defined habitat types. And then you have to decide, or your ecologist has to decide the habitat distinctiveness, which is rated as G here. And if your habitat's not very distinct, you don't need to compensate for it at all. If it's very distinct, then you have to compensate. So there's a high weighting factor here. Is it a distinct habitat? What condition is it in? If it's poor, the factor is 1. If it's good, the factor is 3. We're going to multiply these together just a second. And then is it connected with other ecological units? Obviously, if it's unconnected, that's a low value. If it's highly connected, It's a slightly higher value. These numbers are very strange, but they're the numbers that Defra has chosen to use. And then, is it a strategically significant site within local nature strategies? So your ecologist assesses all of those things. You see the numbers here, the area, and then this component of that. And the metric is simply the multiplication of all those figures together. So we're developing 10 hectares of upland calcareous grassland. These are the figures from the spreadsheet that Defra provides. You multiply that by all these numbers, and the total is 189.7. This is the metric for your development site. Now you have to more than offset this amount of biodiversity in an offset site. We're going to develop all of our 10 hectares for houses. So we have to carry out exactly the same calculation observations for the offset site, but importantly, we have to add 2 additional factors. And the 2 additional factors are, first of all, how difficult will it be to grow this particular habitat on the site? If it's very difficult, then we have a factor of 0.1. If it isn't difficult at all, then we have a factor of 1. For this particular habitat site, it has a difficulty factor of 0.33. And the second factor we need is the temporal multiplier. Basically, if a site takes a long time to reach maturity, then we have a very low factor. For example, a deciduous woodland will take a very long time to grow. If it takes only a year, then we have a high factor. For this particular habitat, it's a factor of 0.49. So if we set aside 10 hectares of offset land to grow the same habitat type, then we'd need to multiply now all of these factors together to get our biodiversity metric of 10 hectares of offset site. And notice these 2 additional factors here, difficulty and the temporal problem of growing that, mean that instead of 189 biodiversity units, we get only 30 units for a site of the same physical size. So what's the developer supposed to do? Because he is obliged to provide a net gain in that activity. The only thing he can do is to grow or to offset a much larger area of land. And remember, the new environmental bill requires 10% biodiversity gain. So again, I'm not sure if you can see the figure at the bottom of the screen, but to achieve net gain of 10%, the 189 units needs to be over 200 units. And to do that, you have to find 68 hectares of land to offset with exactly the same habitat type that you're destroying 10 hectares of to develop. This is a huge ratio. This is a huge increase. And I'm really not sure developers are going to be very happy finding that amount of land to pay for offset, effectively to pay for offsets of that amount of building lands. And the Arc University group wants there to be a 20% net gain, not a 10% net gain. That would require 74 hectares in exchange for 10 hectares of development land. So like for like offset, we're trying to grow the same habitat here. Like for like offset is not area for area offset. You're going to need a very much larger offset area. And the question is, does this amount of land exist? Is it available? So the criticism of the biodiversity metric is, first of all, it's not measuring biodiversity at all. It's measuring habitats. And habitat is taken as a proxy for biodiversity. And quite frankly, it's a very poor proxy for biodiversity. It's a very rough and not very ready measure of proper biodiversity. The second thing is that these offset areas under the environmental bill have to be managed by covenants of 30 or more years, and those covenants have to be paid for by developers and probably will be carried out by wildlife NGOs. They'll be in charge of running that covenant, make sure the offset habitat grows as it's supposed to grow for 30 plus years. That's a pretty enormous cost that developers will have to pay. Now, the offset land, you've got to find land to offset. It's going to be unavailable for any other purpose. A farmer, for example, happy to lose, say, a terminate field for offset, is going to lose that field forever because you have to offset for 30 years. And then, of course, it's no good offsetting for 30 years and then the bulldozers come in and build houses. You haven't achieved net gain. So effectively, the landowner is selling the land under covenant to be developed for offset forever. It seems, as I said, from the numbers we looked at, it seems unlikely that there will be enough offset land locally available. Communities will lose their amenities and see no net gain in their habitats. They'll just see houses. Now, I mentioned the alternative approach, natural capital accounting, which tries to bring nature into the economic framework. The biodiversity metric it's a dimensionless unit. Natural capital accounting allows us to put pounds and pence values on it. So let's imagine dear William Wordsworth wandering in Ullswater, thinking about daffodils, and horror of horrors, Ecobones, a company with fantastic green credentials. You've seen the brochures. It wishes to build a waste incinerator in Ullswater. So the natural capital approach would be, let's look at what we've got at the moment through Wordsworth's poem, and let's see what the natural capital value of that is. Now, floating over vales and hills. Well, vales and hills have amenity value. We like to walk in them, and it has flood prevention values. It prevents floods from downstream. So a value is put on that, £500, let's say. These are arbitrary numbers, but quite frankly, most of the numbers seem to be arbitrary. And then later on, a host of golden daffodils, well, we can pick those and sell them. So they have a market value of £50. And beside the lake, well, water companies are very interested in lakes, so they have a very high value. Let's put a value of £1,000 on the lake. Beneath the trees, well, trees can be used for timber, or they have amenity value. We chop them down for wood, or we like having picnics underneath them. And then finally, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Well, the breeze is good for public health because it takes away pollution. So we'll put a value of £100. So the natural capital value of Wordsworth's Ullswater is £1,850. And it's a per annum value. That's quite important. It's what we're going to call later on a yield from the natural capital in Ullswater. Let's say Ecobones, the waste incinerator company's benefits would be £2,500 a year. It's more than the natural capital value from leaving the habitat as it is. You can see where the argument's going, can't you? Well, if incinerating waste produces more yield than leaving it as it is, incinerating waste just might win. Let's go back to the ARC documents, the Spatial Framework document, to show just how severe this argument's going to be. On page 2 of this document, they give us the figure. Some is estimated, I don't know how, the total ecosystem services across the ARC each year. It's £2.27 billion per year. It's important, it's an annual figure. And you remember that economic prize I mentioned, the economic output, the growth of the economic output is between that, and everybody always talks about the bigger prize here for the transformational development of the ARC involved in the million houses. So it's 2.27 billion ecosystem services, but potentially 163 billion of economic increase. And any economics 101 text will tell you, well, there wouldn't really be any harm in completely concreting over the ARC, losing this 2.27 billion. If you had to pay for it out of the 163 billion, you'd still have a net value of 161 billion each year from concreting over the ARC. What are we doing wrong here? Something's going wrong here because we are undervaluing nature and we are overvaluing the importance of economic output. The problem is that both of these sums here are yields. And if you think of the analogy of a fishery, when we go out fishing, we take the yield from the fishery and we hope not to reduce the stock. But overfishing shows us that if each year we take out too much yield, we actually reduce the stock, and eventually the fishery stock collapses. That's exactly what's happening in global economic systems. And that's explained in great depth by the Dasgupta review, which came out recently, all 600 pages of it, and is much more clearly explained more succinctly by products from your Bennett Institute in Cambridge, these 3 documents here. Now, the point that both documents make is that we have to distinguish between yields and stock. Again, think of the stock as the stock of fish in the sea, and the yield is how much we can take off each year without diminishing the stock. What both of these documents make the point is that we have 3 forms of stock. They're called capital in this in this graphic, but we have capital stock, our factories, we have natural stock, the ecosystem, we have human stock, the people who produce things in the factories and enjoy the nature. These are the stock, and then each of those has some aspect of yield. So our natural capital provides ecosystem services, the capital stock produces the yield of goods and services, and so on and so forth. And also the ecosystem provides our food. And then in the process of manufacturing things and just in living, of course, there's pollution which has an impact mostly on the natural capital. And what you've got to realize is that for the last century, all of our economics is concentrated on one factor in that very complicated graph, and that is the yield factor of produced capital, gross domestic product or gross value added. We've concentrated on this to the exclusion of more or less everything else, and certainly to the exclusion of the impact we're having on the natural stock of planet Earth. Estimates vary, but it's estimated that we're using natural resources at 1.6 planet Earth capacity at the moment. This cannot go on. We concentrate on GDP as the sole measure of economic success and sustainability. It isn't. It cannot be a measure of sustainability. The race for GDP has blinded us to the impacts we're having on the stock of natural capital. And this single graph in Dasgupta's document shows it very clearly. What we've got here is the percentage change in the capital stock. The world is becoming wealthier. We have more wealth. This isn't the yield, this is the stock. Human stock has increased because the human population has increased, but both of those have been achieved, if you like, or attained in the face of a diminishing natural stock. This is the fishery. If we diminish it so far, the whole of the rest of the system will simply collapse. We cannot go on over-exploiting the natural world in the way that we've been doing. So what Dasgupta and the Bennett Institute say is that we need to reassess economics and look at wealth. And of course, this is what the development goals, the sustainable development goals are also talking about. The wealth is the stocks plus the yields of natural and human and productive capacity of the Earth. It's a better measure of how well we are doing on planet Earth, because basically if the wealth stays constant or increases, then we're not diminishing natural stock and we can have a better standard of life. If the wealth diminishes, then we're on the road to extinction. So let's go and look at the Ark's promise to double nature. This is embedded in the documents about improving nature across the Ark. Remember, it's always conditional on development. Various documents came out about how to double nature. And the very phrase doubling nature, of course, came from the Nature Cambridgeshire. And there's the definition of putting nature at the heart of a development agenda. And the idea of doubling nature was then picked up by the Ark Universities group with an environmental work group embedded within it. And you've got the statement there of sustainable economic growth can be achieved, and we can also improve the environment across the Ark. We can call it the green Ark. We can have both. No, we can't have growth. We can't have both unless we do a lot more joined up thinking. Let's have a look at what the challenge of doubling nature would be just in your county, Cambridgeshire. The question is, what do you want to double? This map shows the legally protected areas of Cambridgeshire. You've got the green belt around the city here. You've got sites of special scientific interest in red, special areas of conservation, RSPB reserves, local nature reserves, and national nature reserves, all in the outline polygons. And looking at that map, the conclusion is, well, there's not much there, is there? There really isn't very much to double. That should be easy. That should be easy. I talked with Rupert Maysfield of the RSPB recently. He pointed out that the Environmental Working Group is now looking not just at these legally protected sites, but at something called priority habitats defined by Natural England, as you can see there. Most threatened, the ones which require conservation action under the Biodiversity Action Plan. Now, there's more habitat here, certainly, but again, it's equally and worryingly patchy. There aren't very large patches of anything there. To zoom into your city, for example, There are the patches around your city. You might need some names on that. So here you've got some names, you can locate things. And again, it's a really patchy situation. Wildlife doesn't like patches. It's very, very bad for survival. I've looked at the priority habitats across the 5 counties of the Arc. So you've got the 5 counties, the different colours here, and the histograms are, in this case, the percentage, in fact, the total percentage of each of these counties, which is covered by these different sorts of habitat types. So across the Arc, deciduous woodland is by far and away the most abundant. It occupies between 5% and just under 8% of the different counties. There's not much of anything else. There really isn't much of anything else. This is the totality of each of these habitat sites. The worrying thing is that if we look at the average patch size of each of those habitats, so you've got 7%, for example, of Bucks is deciduous woodland. What's the average size of a deciduous woodland patch in Buckinghamshire? Here we've got the average patch size here of that woodland in Buckinghamshire. It's 1 hectare, this unit here. And in fact, although there wasn't much grassland altogether across the Arc, where you've got grassland, you've actually got bigger patches of it across all 5 counties. These are very, very small patches. And in fact, the yellow line there is 1 rugby pitch. It's 1 hectare. That's the size of most of the habitat patches across 5 counties. Nature is in a pretty drastic and dire situation across 5 counties. This is before we add the 1 million houses and all the infrastructure with it. The importance of a small habitat patch is shown here. This is a very classic ecological relationship. It's called the species area relationship. As the habitat patch size increases, you get more species. The reason is at very small habitat patch sizes, extinction rates are high and colonization rates are low. So life doesn't do very well in small patches. It does slightly better in larger patches. When the size of your patch is a rugby pitch, clearly you can't have many elephants or buffaloes living in it. You might have a few insects. In 2010, John Norton's Making Space for Nature asked for £1 billion annually with no strings attached to protect and enhance nature. Not a great deal of money in the national exchequer. He wanted to make nature bigger, better and more joined up. 10 years later, he wrote to the Prime Minister in September last year, pointing out how little has been achieved in the interim and repeating his request for no strings attached funding for nature. Trouble is, with the net gain and natural capital approaches we're being encouraged to take, some parts of nature may be improved, but only at the cost of losing other parts of nature to development. Let's look at the conclusions. First of all, the Ox Camargue isn't unique. There really are other places with equal or better potential. Squeezing 1/3 of all housing growth in the UK to 2050 to less than 5% of the UK land area doesn't make any sense at all and puts huge pressures on the existing resources across the Arc. That silo mentality has led to non-joined up thinking across transport, infrastructure, nature, and so on. We need more holistic and joined up thinking. Biodiversity net gain is suspect. Natural capital accounting concentrates on yields and not stock. The global experience with both net gain and no net loss is very poor. UK experience is limited. Outcomes are poor. We need better methods of accounting for human, natural and capital yield and stock, in other words, wealth, because only that will lead to real sustainability. Silo thinking suggests we can have it all. In fact, of course, we can't. Doubling nature from a very sparse base is going to be extremely difficult indeed. So we need not just bigger, better and more joined up nature, which was John Lawton's plea. We need bigger, better and more joined up Arc thinking at all. And this is the view that I think many of us have of the beautiful countryside between our 2 beautiful cities. And this is the danger of what it might become if the Arc develops as proposed. Thank you very much.